handy?
Oh, I don't know.
Hello?
No.
Ooh, yeah. Do you want to do a wee hello in yours?
Hello, testing. Does that sound okay? Oh, great.
Hi. Thanks for being here on this now slightly brighter Friday lunchtime for an event that I promise will actually make you kinder. Today we have the author of This Book Will Make You Kinder, James Garrett. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
As many of you, I'm sure, will already know, Henry is a writer, cartoonist, who built up an Instagram following by drawing animals and objects talking to one another as an amusing way to make political points about human cruelty. He wrote a book called This Book Will Make You Kinder, and he lives with his partner Kitty and dog Billy in Brighton. And this is Billy with the book. Today we're just going to have a really casual chat, and I want to plant a seed in your minds of having a think about the last act of kindness that you experienced from someone, and then we might loop back to that later. So to kick us off, I'm going to ask you, what do you mean by kindness in the book, and why is kindness important?
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely to be here. Yeah, so there was an initial iteration of the title of this book, which was going to be This Book Will Make You Slightly More Moral. And the brain trust behind the book, which included my partner Kitty and my editor, were kind of intent on making this book as accessible and pick-upable as possible, and like that was really important to me as well. But actually, that style of writing doesn't come very naturally to me, and like I've had some nice comments about like how readable it is, but I write like really like tight and like, do you know what I mean, really wordy. But that's fundamentally what I mean, because I wanted to write a book about all of morality, like all of the good and the bad that we do to one another. But the sort of language of morality isn't very appealing to people, and I think that like there are very good reasons for that, because I think, you know, it has sort of a ring of religiosity about it, and there's a lot of sort of moral imperialism of people taking their morality and enforcing it on others. But I do also think that when we don't use words like that's like morally bad, we can tend to use words where we're saying the same thing, but we're kind of avoiding saying it. And I think people use like problematic a bit like that, you know, like, oh, that's problematic. And they're not willing to say like, they're not willing to condemn it, but they're like kind of finding a way to, anyway. So I would like us to move back to moral language a bit, if we can find a way. But so that was part of what I was doing was switching to kindness language, because I thought it would be more applicable. And also you can then tap into this thing where there's kind of a zeitgeisty hashtag be kind going on at the moment. And you know, people are using that language of kindness to mean, I think often like the very bare minimum of like, don't abuse people on Twitter, take out your neighbour's bins and stuff. And I think that's like great stuff to do. But I think it's interesting. I mean, we've all seen this, right? When people have like hashtag be kind in their Twitter bio, and then, you know, they're not willing to take that to the step of like, well, actually, if we're going to be kind to one another, that probably requires us to intervene when we see like street harassment going on, or like, you know, maybe it's not very kind if deportations are occurring in your name and you're not doing anything about it, or you're actively voting for people who so I guess that's what I was trying to do, is connect this sort of spectrum of kindness so that people see it as all one thing, rather than like, you know, there's like day-to-day, like maybe it's niceness that people mean, like being nice to one another on a daily basis, and you know, that stuff is good for the same reason that feeding everyone is good. Do you know what I mean? But we're willing to talk about the former, but not, you know, or the former can be very easily agreed upon, but the latter for some reason is a source of some dispute. So yeah, sorry, that was a long way to say that's what I mean by kindness, and that's why I think kindness is important.
I think it is an important distinction. That's why it was also my opening question. Is I think a lot of us like to think that we are nice people, and so to a certain degree, it's sort of, if you already think you're a nice person, why are you picking up the book?
We have had a problem with people finding it awkward to give this book as a gift because of the implication. So some people were like, I wanted to get it for my partner for Christmas, but...
I got it from my dad, who may be watching this on the live stream. Hi, Dad.
Didn't mean anything by it.
Yeah, but I think that it's that reminder that we could all, and the language of kindness has heart and meaning that runs through it, that niceness or morality are sort of the two other extremes. One is very surface level, and the other one, people might feel like, oh, if I'm going to talk about morality or engage with morality, I need to know something about philosophy. Yeah,
it becomes very abstract very quickly, and it's not like moral philosophers are like, you know, really, really moral people either, so like, it doesn't even do all that much good to study it.
Which brings me to my next question, which is that this really is a book of philosophy and morality written by someone who is a philosopher, and it's masquerading as something that is fun and funny. It is fun and funny as well. So how did you come to write this particular book in this particular way?
Yeah, I think that's very true, and I think this book came about the way it did because of sort of the way in which my weird career came about, which, like, I don't know, some people in the audience may have heard this story 1,000 times because I tell it on Instagram quite a lot, but I was a kid who wanted the world to be kinder, but was also very, like, argumentative, and, like, I've kind of let go of, like, argumentation as a form of communication. I think there's a lot of that, again, in philosophy departments, like, debate me, you know, and I no longer associate that so much with kindness. But I thought I would go into philosophy because I thought that's where people talked about, like, you know, why should people do more moral good than they currently do, right? I thought that would be a good place to answer that question, hopefully in a convincing way. And then I was going to be a philosophy professor, and I was going to write these books that were going to make everyone who read them kinder or better, or, you know, and it was going to make the world amazing. And it turns out if you go into a philosophy PhD with such grandiose ideas, you drop out due to anxiety, and that's what I did. So I dropped out of philosophy, and I had already started doing my cartoons, which we're going to like look at a few cartoons.
I'll just pull one over.
Yeah, pull one up so that if people haven't any idea of what I do. I had already been doing some cartoons on Instagram, but at that point it was called Drawings of Dogs because it was just dogs, and the humor was not really very political. It was just dark humor, a lot of toilet humor, you know. But it was like a side thing that I was doing with my philosophy. But once I dropped out of the philosophy, I took that energy of like, oh, I need to make the world a better place, and it sort of found its way into my cartoons. And then the cartoons started to build a little bit of a following, and then that's how the book came about. Like, I think that's why I was allowed to write the book that I did. So it's kind of a weird, cool, full circle thing for me, where that's how I got back to writing this book, and that's the reason this book is this masquerading, like, you know, oh, because the cartoons let me do it. The cartoons probably why people pick it up. But then I wrote what I had always wanted to write. But to your point, and we can talk about this with the cartoons, there is a danger in the way in which I write and in which I cartoon, in that it's my form of communication to like try and get someone to change their mind is very like humorous and like lighthearted, and you know, it has these animals, and so people maybe turn off their defensiveness for like a second, and it kind of gets through that, and I think there's something wonderful about that, and I like that people connect with my work because of that. But at the same time, there's a sort of palatability thing going on there, where people like the way that I talk about these things and are willing to listen to me, and that's a real problem if that's, you know, as far as they get. And you know, palatability is going to affect who you listen to, but also what you're willing to hear, because some things just can't can't be made palatable. There's some things that I couldn't make a charming cartoon about. So I guess I'm cautioning not to enjoy my cartoons too much, or not to enjoy them at the exclusion of listening to someone else who is more uncomfortable to listen to, who might actually have more to say.
I feel like they're like a gateway.
Hopefully, yeah. If they're a gateway, then I'm okay with that. Yeah. I think that's the goal, is for them to be a gateway. But if they're like a gateway and then a stopping point, then that's not ideal.
Yeah, not if you're doing your job right.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I just get a show of hands in the room who knows Henry from Instagram cartoons? And who came just because you want to be kinder and you were hoping...
Let's see what we can do.
So I'm going to share a few of the cartoons, and then Henry and I are going to talk about them. So the next one... Oh, my mouse is on this side. This side? So for anyone who can't read it on the screen, it says, a gay duck and a straight duck walk into a bar. They have a great time. Ducks never developed homophobia. How did this cartoon come to be?
It's a very hard question to answer how each cartoon comes to be, but I'll often start, I either start with like an animal, like an idiom, like, I have looked up, and this feels like cheating if I'm honest, I have looked up animal idioms before and then used those as like jumping off points. But I'll either start with an animal I want to draw, or like a theme I want to talk about, or sometimes, something just comes to you sort of fully formed. But yeah, I think I like this one because maybe you think it's going to be something else. And, I like that. I like the way that they can wander around through the internet and someone can see it and expect one kind of joke and then get a different kind of joke. But yeah, this is quite an old one, and I'm quite happy with that one.
I enjoy this one.
Thank you.
This illustration for me was one of the many in your book that are just, they're those little pauses, and almost like your brain fills in a gap on something. It's like, oh, it's a duck drawing. And then you have this unexpected realization of like, oh yeah, we did do that as a society. We did develop homophobia. We did that to ourselves and to other people. And your drawing kind of just gets it like that little nubbin of truth that opens up a space for conversation. And so I wanted to ask you to just leap off sideways on that. A big part of the book, and at the heart of the book, is empathy and making space for empathy and enabling empathy, and also unlearning the things that stop us from feeling empathy. So could you talk a little bit about sort of within that mechanism of kindness, the role that empathy plays?
Yeah, so the thesis of the book, which, might sound quite simple when you put it like this, is that doing the right thing, morality, or like being kind to one another, is motivated by empathy. And we all have the capacity for empathy. And it's actually automatic, and lots of the time we can't stop it from happening. But we also have a lot of false beliefs. We have like a lack of knowledge in certain areas and about certain types of experience, and we fail to imagine the consequences of our action fully. And all of those things prevent us from empathizing as we would if we knew more. So that's sort of the argument of the book, and so now you don't have to read it. No, you can if you want. So yeah, I think, sorry, what was the question again?
So it's just about that role that empathy plays in because I think in a little drawing like this, or it's just that idea, that reminder that like.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with some of the ones that rely on the animal character so directly is that you'll get a load of comments like, actually ducks are really cruel to one another, and like, actually ducks do this, and you know, and that's fundamentally not what the cartoons are about. I'm not saying that like all animals are moral saints, and I hope my cartooning doesn't rely on that. I think what we do distinctively, and I don't want to make this as like some grand biological claim, is we invent whole belief systems and myths that allow us to not feel certain suffering that we would otherwise feel. And so maybe we have a greater capacity for empathy. Maybe we can empathize with more types of experience because we can learn more about the world. But while we're learning more about the world, we can get off track. We can come to believe, you know, maybe we have some religious account of why, you know, homosexuality is wrong, or, you know, we believe something about, you know, how it's unnatural or something like that, which is, you know, an incoherent argument. So I don't think, as far as I know, that a duck has the capacity to believe something like that that would bring it to then hate someone on that basis or not partake in their suffering on that basis. If you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying ducks are saints, but I am saying ducks lack something that we have, which is about our ability to create these belief systems that allow us to perpetrate cruelty that we may want to perpetrate for other reasons.
Yeah, I think, so in the book you talk about, and here you've touched on it with like, there might be a reason that where homophobia might, you know, where you might not be able to empathize with someone who is LGBTQ is because you have learned that there is something wrong, and there's a process of unlearning.
Absolutely.
And in the book you also talk about that in relation to rape myths and people's inability to sort of hear past because they're told the same messages over and over again about what they should expect. And so learning empathy as an active pursuit involves both that opening up to other people's experiences and then actively unlearning the things that switch off.
I think that's a big, that's definitely a big theme, is that it's mostly about unlearning. I think, you know, the empathy is already there, like waiting to happen. You can empathize with anyone. There has to be something that's telling you not to, that gets in the way.
I'm going to pull over another drawing.
Absolutely.
This one.
This was when I was at Drawings of Dogs, so it has the old
It's a good
tag
old
on.
turnip, and it says "Turn up for sex workers," which is a, as I was saying before, it shouldn't be a radical proposition, but it is a radical proposition. And so I wanted to use this particular drawing as a leap-off point to ask you about how you encounter a lot of the social justice issues that appear in the book, and then how you go about then engaging in a conversation and then created a drawing that is then the gateway for other people when it's not about you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first answer would be that I do and have gotten things wrong, you know, and, you know, like I've put up cartoons and then, you know, someone has talked to me about the language that I've used or things like that, and then I try and, you know, listen because that's what, and I've changed cartoons and I've, you know, I've deleted cartoons that I felt, you know, like fair point, that was off the mark. To how I sort of come about, how I come across the issues that I then draw about. I mean, again, a big like caveat at the very start of the book is that it's not a book written from like, oh, I'm some like kindness superhero. Like, it's very much like only because I've thought about this a lot. Like, am I writing about it? It's not because I'm like superior kindness that needs to like offload. So I don't know. I definitely don't want to be claiming that I'm like super well informed or super tuned in. I think lots of us.
But you are.
Oh, that's kind. Yeah. I learn a lot from the internet, And I think that's like an incredible thing and, you know, a dangerous thing as well. Like, but for me personally, I don't know who I would be without, you know, the internet, like with Twitter and Instagram, and then hopefully going deeper and finding, you know, the books that often those people are talking about having learned from. I like to read a lot, but like, it's also just, it's so much to do with who you meet, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's why I really like try not to. I know I could have been a very different version of me, and I'm sure this is true for lots of us. And like, you know, as I said earlier, like I was a debate me teenager, and you know, was watching stand-up comics like, you know, what more do women want, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I say that in the book, and like, so, and I know that it's not through. I don't think it's through something good about me that I ended up listening. Do you see what I mean? Like, and I think that's something we all have to keep hold of. Is like, there's a lot of moral luck, and there's a lot of happenstance that results in us having the beliefs we do, even when we're confident that they are the right beliefs. It is about who we meet, and like, I met my partner Kitty, and I've learned like so much of what I've learned from her, and when we were falling in love, she was doing a gender studies master's, and I got to do like gender studies by like, you know, once removed, because like she would send me the papers that she was reading, and like we'd talk about the lectures that she just had in it. So that was like an amazing turning point for me. And then it's just like a rabbit hole, isn't it? And like that, like if you want that rabbit hole, it's such an exciting thing, because like so much of it is free on the internet. So yeah, I just try and listen and learn.
Yeah.
You know?
I think in that way, the book is very clear about the fact that we all have the capacity to be kinder, and also sometimes, and a lot of the time, it's not about changing people's minds about something, it's about changing a capacity to hear or to listen, or a desire to hear or to listen. I want to, I keep losing my mouse.
Shall I read this one out?
Yeah, go for it.
So the stick is saying, sticks and stones can break my bones. And the stone is saying, and words can serve to restrict the rights and freedoms of people from oppressed groups, and in brackets, and also often serve as a precursor to sticks and stones.
I wanted to use this particular drawing to talk about power dynamics. And one of the things you touch on the book in terms of sort of expanding our capacity for empathy is that it's not about saying to people who experience oppression or injustice that somehow you have to empathize with your oppressor more, or if you only just understood why they're treating you this way, or you know, that it's not about that. And so can you unpack that idea?
Yeah, I think that would be a version of this book that could get written, and I think there are books out there like that, which very much see like more empathy as a two-way street, you know, and the reason it's not a two-way street and that there's an asymmetry there is because of an asymmetry of power, and when one group has power over another group, they also have power over beliefs about those groups and ideologies, and so that is why sticks and stones, that is why words can be as violent as sticks and stones, both in and of themselves. Like I'm not minimizing that, but like because of the way in which words are an act, and that act has consequences in the world, and those consequences can be to make people more vulnerable to sticks and stones. And yeah, so again, like if I had ended up doing the philosophy version of this, I can imagine writing like a sort of power blind version,
Right.
In which in which it talked about kindness as empathy at full knowledge, which is kind of the central thesis, but they didn't talk about how they didn't make it epistemic, and I think that's the biggest flip switch in my brain that I've ever had.
Right.
Is this idea that I may be situated poorly in relation to certain kinds of knowledge, and some people may be experts in relation to certain kinds of knowledge, and the people who are experts are the people who are experiencing particular kinds of oppression. And for me, that was like a crystallizing, I mean, it's going to sound obvious to so many people, but for me, that was like a crystallizing idea that I think, you know, came out of gender studies and Kitty. And like, again, it talks about this in the book, but I'm not saying that like people aren't culpable for their ignorance. And that's really important to not excuse that ignorance that, you know, white men have, because it's an ignorance that requires maintenance, an ignorance that requires like actual work to keep it going. But explaining it can help explaining it to people like me, and that realization that there's a reason that you believed what you did. It gives you an account of you know, why certain things that seemed obvious to you are in fact untrue. Which I think is a useful account to have, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
I have another drawing. Do you want to read this one out?
Sure. So there's a butterfly, and the butterfly's body was actually based on the hungry caterpillar. I tried to use the colorings from that. But the butterfly is saying, "Hello, I am a butterfly." And there's a snail, and the snail is saying, "Hello, caterpillar, you are a caterpillar." And the tagline is transphobia.
This is one of my favorites. I think it makes so obvious a lot of things that seem really ludicrous when you take a step back and you're like, but what?
Yeah, this is one of my favorites as well, but this is one of my favorites because I think I drew this after having watched Transparent, which is a beautiful TV show that obviously then a cis white man ruined the experience of, you know what I mean, like that was. But I drew this drawing, and then I connected with Alexandra Billings, who was one of the actresses in that show. And that was like really beautiful. Like, I don't know, I love beautiful full circle moments. But yeah, this drawing is not about the experience of being trans, because I don't think that the butterfly is necessarily a good metaphor for the experience of being trans, because trans people always were who they tell us they are. But it is hopefully an okay analogy for just treating people as experts in themselves, and not taking your own account of who someone is and fixing upon that. And if someone tells you, this is who I am, this is what my experience is, you have a good reason to straightforwardly believe them. And so yeah, that's what this is about. It's just believe people, treat them as experts in themselves. Yeah.
And I think a lot of your drawings do just sort of capture that kind of thing. And at the heart of the book is a lot of just that, about taking a step back and looking at an experience and being like, you know, where am I stepping in and deciding that I know better, or that I have filled in for an expectation of what someone might say or experience. And the book kind of dislodges that in some really beautiful ways.
Yeah.
My next question was about the book as a handbook. It's an empathy handbook. You have exercises at the end, but you also pull short of actually recommending like actions or organizations to be involved in. Can you tell us a bit more about the handbook? I'm going to pull up the bunny.
Oh yeah, go for it. Yeah, again, an alternative title was the Empathy Manifesto, but apparently Manifesto has some problems as well, so didn't go with that. Yeah, so really what I was trying to do with the book, I didn't want to suggest specific actions, specific ways to take things forward, because I think that there absolutely is a place for a book like that, and there are lots of books like that on specific social justice issues, and they're incredible, and way better than I ever could have written. I think if my book does something useful, it's in being more abstract than that, and it's about hopefully the book moves us away from like specific calls to action or specific issues that we might engage with, and moves us further back than that, because the problem is that we all know people who we could give a book of like, here's some firm actions to take, and that they would not read that book, or if they did read it, they read it just to tear it apart. And so I don't know if this book will have this effect, but the aspiration is that you could read this first and then you might be more primed. And I think what I arrive at is the view that the sort of central moral virtue is being a good listener. And I think like we say like, oh, she's such a good listener. And we don't think of that as like that important. I think that can be quite like, that's like a good character trait. But I want to make a claim that's being a good listener, someone who is unable to hear what someone is telling you about their experience, is the only way in which we can become morally better. So what I do give is sort of my listening tips. And again, I'm not saying like I'm an amazing listener, but I know some really good listeners. And again, I'm going to jump back to Kitty, but my partner's an amazing listener. So it's kind of, so there are tips on that. And there'll be things like get comfortable being wrong, even drastically wrong. Create and hold space for people to be heard, because you can't listen if someone doesn't feel safe to speak. And you can read the rest of them in the book. But yeah, so I arrive at the only way in which you're going to become kinder, and the only way in which I'm going to become kinder, is doing the hard work of listening. And we have a cartoon about that. Those are some pretty cute bunnies. I'm pleased with those.
I think a lot of what spoke to me in the book that I feel has been reflected in my time at the bookshop and at Lighthouse and seeing people come through the door is that kindness and empathy and listening and curiosity about other people, which then, once you have opened that door, it's very hard to close it, to not care. Once you know people are being deported, once you know that, know more about the experience of people who might have fled the horror of war and spent days on a dinghy and risked their lives and lost people along the way, you can't unknow that. And the world tries really hard to then, and media and our politicians, to then dehumanize that learning that we've done. And so it's sort of holding on to opening those new doors. And in the shop, I see every day people who will pick up a book, and simply by experiencing that other world, it's opened that door. And so it's also feeding the curiosity to learn more, to take a risk, to open something new, to expose yourself to something new, to new people. Being in this room is really cool. So that wasn't even a question. It's just me on my soapbox. I'm going to ask a final question, and then I'm going to give you lot a chance to ask your questions. And then if you have been pondering in the back of your mind, like that nice thing, that kind thing that you might have experienced, if you want to share it briefly in the question time. We live in it's a hard time, and there's a lot of unkindness, and sometimes just being reminded of the goodness of people can help, basically. So my last question is, when it comes to kindness, how do we avoid preaching to the converted?
I think that's a great question.
Sorry, guys.
And a big part of the answer is, like, I don't know. And I think I probably do spend a fair amount of my time preaching to the choir. And I sort of think that that's okay, because I think, you know, lots of us who think of ourselves as part of the choir, you know, maybe aren't as good at some tunes as others, and there may be domains in which we have an awful lot to learn. But there's also a question of our resolve to do what needs to be done, and there's a question of cohesiveness and learning, you know, about practical connections. You know, so we're in a space with some amazing books, and, you know, we potentially are the people who would pick up those books, and we all will go deeper in the connections between different fights, and I think that that's really important. But yeah, as I said, I do think that some people won't pick up certain types of books, or if they were compelled to read them, wouldn't take anything from them, and that's because, as you've said, of the ways in which they're primed with ideologies that prevent them from humanizing the experiences that they're reading about. And I think with that is the answer, and I'm probably not the first person to say this, I know I'm not the first person to say this, the answer is probably action, us, the choir, taking action, action that is visible, that is directly connected to the cruelty we're trying to prevent, and that is personally costly. Because I think when we see people doing that, and when I see people doing that, you think it kind of breaks the spell. We're talking about social norms here, and they're like a spell, and something can break through. And what breaks through for me is seeing someone who's willing to, you know, lie down in front of a van, because that's so straightforward, and it's so connected to the cruelty of deportations, and it's in some ways so obvious, right? And I think we need, as you keep saying, reconnect with the obvious, right? That if your neighbour was being forced to, you know, was being imprisoned and then potentially forced to board a flight to somewhere that they've never lived, well, you would probably lie down in front of that van. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And when you see someone do it reminds me of the obviousness of that, which you can definitely forget. And so I think probably we avoid preaching to the choir through action, but that's not to say that there's not a vital power in books to teach us, you know, which actions to take and to connect struggles, and to not, as we were learning from the talk before, to not fight the same battles in the same ways, because we've got to learn from our histories of resistance.
I think for not having an answer, that was a pretty good answer. And it's one that I battle with every day and in the shop, and I'm sure that everyone who's here, that idea that, you know, how do we reach out and make more people make sense? But I think also there was a climate activist and Indigenous writer last night on a panel who was talking about disability as a disability justice campaigner, and Jen Deerenwater was talking about how simply existing as a disabled person in the world inevitably means that you have a really creative way of navigating it, because the world is not designed for you to exist comfortably in it. Actually, quite the opposite. And so if you find a way to include disabled voices in your activism, then you are not just pulling in representation because we should have a variety of voices, but that you will learn a whole bunch of things that you could only learn from disabled people. And so to a certain degree, even within the choir, if we can do better making our movements kinder and more inclusive, and more able to listen and not be the same voices, then when we are taking action, they end up being actions that are more inclusive and do the obvious in other ways.
I think that's a really important point. Yeah.
Do you have any questions, or would you like to share a moment of kindness with us? Oh, we have one. Give me a sec. I'm going to mask, and then I'm going to get
a microphone. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
There you go.
I have 2 questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, one is about straight up, like, just how you decided which comic to pair with which part of the book, because sometimes through the book, like, the comic doesn't really have anything to do with what is happening when you're writing about a specific section, so what was the idea behind it? And then the other question is about the call to action that you do at the end. So as we were saying before, there's a lot going on in the world, and once you start noticing things, you can't stop unnoticing them. And so my question was like, how do you focus your effort? Like, once you know everything, and you know how much work there is, and you know that there's stuff that you don't know, how do you transport all of that knowledge and all of that kindness into actual action in a way that doesn't burn yourself out, or in a way that doesn't like kind of paralyze you? And my kindness moment was my therapist started bringing me Dr. Pepper, so she knows that I like it.
Aww.
So at the beginning of the session, she just said to me over Dr. Pepper. So that's it. Thank you.
Oh, that's lovely.
Thank you.
So the first question is easier. So with where the cartoons were placed, the text is kind of separate to the cartoons. The text, there are drawings, the doodles very much correspond, but the cartoons were very much, I think it's interesting how the connections that people do draw, like, oh, he must have put that there deliberately, and I think that's fascinating, and that's happened for me as well, but they were fairly randomly scattered as, you know, as a way for people to have some light relief while they were reading, and then the text of the book was written almost like an essay that I had wanted to write. To your second question, I, again, would say that there's a big part of me that would say, I don't know, because I'm not the best actor in the ways that we're talking about. And some barriers for me are like anxiety and, you know, turning up to things and being like, oh, is this the right group to be part of? And also just the social aspect of being in a space. But I think I know that the answer is to find one's people and to work with them. But I'm not amazing at that myself, because, you know, people are scary. But I think that's, you know, something we have to work on. But to avoid burnout is vital, and we've got to find sustainable, for us, forms of activism, and that will look very different for different people, and that means you can't look at what someone else is doing and say, oh, they're doing that, I should be doing that. You've got to find, it's much better to find what you can do and keep doing than it is to find what you can do overwhelmingly for a few months, I guess. And you have to really believe that, because otherwise people do, you know, I've seen that a lot, you know?
Mm-hmm. Do we have it? Yeah? My cable's not going to go all the way back to you, hun. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
My question was about, and I apologize if this is covered in the book, I have practically not read it yet.
That's okay.
Too big. I suppose, how do we avoid falling into the pitfalls of empathy? Like, how do we stop empathy from becoming projection, and how do we stop empathy from, I read somewhere that it's basically, it comes from the distinction between the in-group and the out-group, and so we're much more likely to extend empathy to people who are members of a group that we already recognize as similar to us. And so I was wondering if you had any suggestions on how to deal with that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So it's the pitfalls of empathy. And you mentioned the in-group and out-group thing. So to come to that first, I think that actually some of the people who research empathy love that in-group, out-group stuff and make it very exciting sounding in their books on the subject, and make it draw political conclusions from it, which they might be reaching with. And you know, I'm not an empathy scientist, but my understanding is that there is a big distinction. We can see certain suffering and certain types of people suffering and not empathize with it. We can see pain and not feel pain as we would do, and that exists in all mammals, right? But what matters, and this is what I say in the book, is what the mechanism for that is. And is the mechanism that, you know, we have a detection unit that tells us that person, you know, is less likely to be genetically related to me than that person, therefore I should extend my empathy to that person, not to that person. And my understanding is that that's not the case, and that the limits of empathy are based on familiarity and how much. So I talk about the rat experiment in the book, and you know, as a vegan, I'm not so sure if I should include accounts of experimentations on animals, but there you go. But they experimented on rats, and you know, you can get a rat to save another rat from a trap. And they'll do that automatically because they witness suffering and they do what they can to alleviate it. And if you get rats of two different colours, it stops happening. They stop rescuing the rat that's stuck in the trap. But it turns out that was only because the rats were raised around rats that were the same colour of them. If you raise a white rat only among other black rats, it fails to empathise with white rats and only empathises with black rats. So it's not like we have a detection unit that's telling us that's innate and that's telling us from the get-go who we have to empathise with. What we have is the capacity to switch our empathy off when someone is unfamiliar, when we perceive someone as from not our group, right? But that perception is social, and we can learn familiarity, and we can create a world in which people are more primed to empathise with everyone. And I think it's possible. I don't think that there's anything in the empathy science that tells us that it's impossible that a person could empathise with every single type of suffering. And, you know, I also think that there's lots to suggest that people can, because you see examples of it every day. And like, if you're like me, you watch YouTube videos of like jaguars raising chimpanzees and stuff. So we know that there's, I can get really deeply into this, but what's really interesting, right, is that some biologists would see a jaguar raising a chimpanzee and say that the jaguar is making a mistake, because biologically speaking, you could argue that there's no chance that the chimpanzee is related to the jaguar, right? So it's not benefiting genes that it's likely to share. But mistake is loaded normative language that actually has no place if you claim to be, you know, do you see what I mean? So the jaguar isn't making a mistake. The universe doesn't care whether the jaguar raises a jaguar or a chimpanzee. And that's like leaping off from evolutionary, you know, you can get into some dark evolutionary ethics if you start handing down that. Sorry, I rambled for a bit there. But it was a great question. And I think the former part of the question was about the other pitfall of empathy, maybe which is overprojection. And, you know, maybe you're saying that you can think someone's feeling a certain way, or you can ascribe, and yeah, like absolutely, that is a danger, and maybe listening is a good antidote. But I'm like a very, empathetic being, and like I think that's worth looking out for. I don't think I have like a really good answer to it, if that's all right.
Is there another question or kindness? There we go.
First of all, thank you for coming.
Oh.
I read the first page of the book. And it says that you feel anxiety, so thank you for showing up. Like, that's pretty cool, in my opinion. So my question is, how do you perform acts of empathy for yourself? Or like, the balance between empathy for yourself versus empathy for others. Because one is, looked as superior rather than the other. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And again, probably we all know people in activist spaces who don't look after themselves well enough through their capacity to share in the suffering of others, right? And I think that's what you're speaking to. And I do know, lots of people like that. And I don't know, I mean, I think there are useful, like, therapeutic ideas there, about, like, for some people there's like a crystallizing moment where they're like, oh, you can't take care of others unless you're taking care of yourself. But, like, you've probably heard that idea by this point, and if it doesn't stick and go in, but it is so true, right? Like, that you can't take care of others. The stronger you are yourself, the more capacity you have to do good, and stronger in the resilient sense that we build by taking care of ourselves. But it is really hard. I think I won't have a satisfying answer on that one. But I think it's, I guess, no, if I did have a satisfying answer, it would again be about your networks, right? It's about who has the ability and permission to intervene with you and to tell you that you've gone too far in your care for others. And I think, like, I want to be careful with the language of too far and the sort of co-option of self-care. And there's a lot of people who, will tell you you can't pour from an empty cup, and they use that as an excuse to, engage in every capitalist form of self-care at the exclusion of really, like, showing up for anyone else. Do you know what I mean? Like, but you need those people who can tell you honestly and truthfully when you have taken it too far and who you believe. I think that's the only thing that works.
We have another one. I will also add, at 11 o'clock on Sunday, we have an event called We Deserve Joy. And a part of that is sort of inspired by Adrienne Marie Brown saying that joy isn't frivolous. And the point should be joy and pleasure, because why are we fighting liberation if the end goal is not to experience joy and fulfilling lives? And so we have to incorporate that ability to gift and be joyful and happy and have pleasure and be good to ourselves as part of movement building. So if you're around on Sunday, I'd recommend it.
I think another part of that is that, like, and this might just be another psychological trick to, like, let yourself be kind to yourself, is like, what sort of example am I setting for everyone else, right? If I tell them that the only way to do good in this world is to be cruel to yourself in the process, who am I inviting in when I do that? Like, no one's gonna want to join that cause. And so that is a part of the answer, right? Is if you truly believe that no one's going to follow your example, if your example looks torturous, then you look for ways to have fun along the way, because otherwise, what is the point?
We have, I think, time for one more.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I have to admit, I haven't read the book. My wonderful friend next to me, who I'm now bringing into this, got it, so I will be taking it from her afterwards. Sorry in advance. My question is what we discussed a little bit in the opening about, like, moral superiority and how there are these barriers to empathy and to even just learning about a lot of the subjects that we mentioned here, and I'm assuming you mentioned in further detail in your book. If you couldn't tell already, I'm not from this country, and I think one of the things that was striking to me upon moving here very recently was the moral superiority of people hearing my accent, and there's all of a sudden things that they bring to mind, sometimes rightfully so, most of the time not rightfully so. And, you know, I am a microcosm of that, and I have very severe privileges that prevent a lot of even worse things. But how do you deal with moral superiority just on a micro and I guess a macro level?
Yeah, really hard. And I'm sorry that's your experience. And, you know, we're in Scotland that I always have like much more positive associations with than England. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but like, I hope people are kinder here. Yeah, I think that's really difficult. We're talking about moral superiority in the sense of someone talking to you and feeling like they must be a morally better person than you. Is that what you mean? Yeah, I definitely encountered that, and I think there's a lot of that on the left, and I think there's a lot of people who, so as a vegan, I can use veganism as an example. There's a lot of people who take, you know, doing the morally right thing in one domain and use that as their, like, get out of jail free card, you know, like, oh, but I'm a vegan, you know, and then the whole thing is like sorted. And I think on a personal level in our relationships, that's really hard. It's really hard for us to be friends with someone like that, to communicate with someone like that. And yeah, it's also a problem on a social level because people who think that they're already there, you know, aren't going to listen and learn, right? And again, fountain of unsatisfying answers, but it's a really difficult one. I'd say my experience of it is that I find that easiest to encounter when I'm happiest with myself and what I'm doing. But again, that's impossible advice to follow. Mm-hmm. But when I feel that I'm doing my best, mm-hmm. I can encounter that, and I can see that as I can see that as a social problem for our movement rather than a personal problem for me. As a social problem for our movement, it's about everyone knowing that they're not there, and that none of us will get there in our lifetime because we'll continue to have to engage with the world as it currently is. I mean, one of the things in the book that might be useful is letting go of the idea that there even are good and bad people, and I think that's something that has been really useful for me. I'm disinterested in like a permanent label of good or bad. I think we all have today to do better, and we all are only doing good because we met the right person and listened to them and got lucky, and we do a lot of bad because of the structures that we're forced to exist in, and we can only move those bit by bit and change our own actions day by day. So yeah, it might be a bit wishy-washy, but none of us, I'm not interested in seeing any of us as any better than any others because I don't really see how that helps anyone. Me thinking of myself as good doesn't make anyone feel better. You know, it doesn't make anyone's life better. So it's more about what can I do today to try and do better than I could do yesterday. But you can't force someone to come to see things that way. But if you see things that way yourself and you're confident in it, it might be easier to encounter those people. I don't know.
And I guess that it's that process of getting kinder is a journey that everyone will be on, hopefully, in different ways, that at some point something crosses their path that then enables that.
Absolutely, and it's really exciting when you do see people, you know, when you encounter a person like that and then you meet them 5 years later and they're a completely different person, and it's easy to be like snotty about that, but like we have to let people change, and we have to let people, because we have to be pumped for them. But obviously there's accountability that might have to occur depending on the harms that they've done in the process, but And at the same time, I think we're all we like to fix people where they are, you know?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I had on a similar experience, or with a parallel, a friend of mine who is Palestinian from Jerusalem would introduce herself at parties as being from Jerusalem, and people would assume that she was Jewish, and people would assume that she was Israeli. And at times when people found out that she wasn't, the reactions could be quite extreme. People felt misled, having made that assumption. But also a lot of people turned around and said, like, I don't think I would have been able to engage with you the way that I have if I had known that if I hadn't made this assumption. And then it made that space for them to connect with her humanity. And I mean, it's terrible and awful that they wouldn't have been able to see a young Palestinian woman and just make a space for her full experience. But that space and ambiguity that she left allowed them a moment to connect. And after many years of taking that approach with people, she has since decided not to do that, because there's also a huge amount of emotional labor in then that pivoting moment of being like, and then how will they react? And I think that there's a space for all of us to negotiate for ourselves, how much of ourselves we put out there to enable other people to learn and listen, and for that to go both ways. Did anyone have a final moment of kindness that they wanted to share? Okay, we have some brown paper on the wall, and if you're feeling shy, you can write your kindness on the wall. And I wanted to wrap up with one of the kindnesses I see in the shop on a regular basis, which is our Pay It Forward wall. Has anyone not heard of the Pay It Forward wall? If you want to just do a wee show of hands. So our Pay It Forward wall, we started right after the last general election with another Tory government, and we were so mad, and it just was like, fuck, austerity continued, and this was before the pandemic, and I was just like, come on! And there was rage, but there was also this moment of like, well, if they're not going to sort it out, then we need to find other ways to look out for each other. And we started a system whereby anyone who had £1, 50p, a little bit extra, could add that money to a pot, and then anyone could use that pot to buy books at any point in time, because sometimes some people are broke some people are poor, and other people are broke at the end of the month, and you should always be able to access books. And it's just that little, it's not charity, it was like, I know what it feels like and how important it is to have access to books and reading. And the books and reading that might not be in the library, that might only be available from somewhere like Lighthouse, and so they're always available. And so this is a shout out to anyone who has ever put £1 in or taken £1 out, for being a part of that active community and charity. And spread the word that people can always access books for free if they need to from the bookshop. And just to wrap us up, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you have a little kindness to end this event on that you want to share?
I'm going to put you back on the spot, because I was really nervous about coming, and you made me feel very at ease, and you let me know like all of the requirements from me in advance, and it's just felt like a really lovely experience, and it could have been a really difficult experience for me, so that was very kind of you.
You are very welcome. Well, thank you all very much, and thank you, Henry, for making the trip. We are going to be at the back by the crafting table.